Imagine being so short that the other kids laugh at you, and still convincing the world you were born to rule it. That was Napoleon Bonaparte at 9, growing up on the rocky island of Corsica. On paper, his family had noble blood. In reality, they were basically nobility with a coupon code. At school, he was mocked for his accent, his manners, and especially his height. He wasn't the golden boy. He wasn't the athlete. He was the one teachers sighed about when taking attendance. But Napoleon didn't chase approval. While the other kids played games, he buried himself in books. History, mathematics, geography. His notebooks weren't castles and dragons. They were cannons, cavalry charges, and maps of battles no one else cared about. Teachers called him arrogant, stubborn, maybe even unbearable. But they also admitted, with a hint of annoyance, that he was brilliant. And his heroes? Not fairy tale knights. Caesar, Hannibal, Alexander. He didn't just admire them, he studied them like rivals. At 9 years old, he was already walking around like a retired general stuck in the wrong body. To everyone else, he was a short Corsican boy with big problems. To himself, he was destiny waiting for a draft notice. By 16, Napoleon wasn't just the short kid from Corsica anymore. He was the short kid stuck in a French military academy, which, honestly, was its own kind of punishment. Imagine being dropped into a school full of rich Parisian boys with perfect accents and family money. And you show up sounding like a Corsican goat herder with hand-me-down shoes. He was teased relentlessly. His classmates looked down on him, not as a future commander, but as someone who didn't belong. Did it bother him? Oh, absolutely. But instead of sulking, he doubled down. He turned every insult into fuel. Every joke about his height became another reason to outwork everyone else. While others bragged about their estates and parties, Napoleon was nose-deep in math, strategy, and artillery manuals. His idea of a wild knight? Calculating trajectories for imaginary cannonballs. Teachers noticed. They said he was obsessive, moody, maybe even unbearable. But he was also the one student they'd bet on surviving an actual war. So yeah, he didn't have the height, the charm, or the pedigree. But he had brains, stubbornness, and a chip on his shoulder the size of Corsica. And history loves a chip like that. At 26, Napoleon got his first real audition with history. Paris was chaos. Royalists on one side, revolutionaries on the other, and everyone basically screaming, "Who's in charge here?" Enter Napoleon. The government asked him to stop a royalist uprising. Most people would panic, write a polite letter declining, maybe move to Switzerland. Napoleon? He lined up cannons and blasted grape shot directly into the crowd. Brutal, sure. But it worked. The revolt ended in minutes, and suddenly, this unknown Corsican was the new rising star. The newspapers called it decisive. His enemies called it barbaric. Napoleon called it Tuesday. That single moment, a whiff of grape shot, made his reputation. The guy who had once been bullied for his accent and size was now the man who saved Paris. And here's the thing, he wasn't just about brute force. He calculated everything, down to how the smoke would intimidate and how the noise would break morale. He didn't just fight battles, he staged them like theater. One day he's a junior officer that nobody cares about. The next, he's walking through Paris like he owns the place. Spoiler, he was just getting warmed up. 3 years later, at 27, Napoleon took command of the French army in Italy. Which sounds glamorous, until you realize the army was starving, underpaid, and more likely to stab him for bread than salute him. But Napoleon had something they hadn't seen before: energy. He didn't just bark orders from a tent. He marched with them, shared their rations, even endured the same mud and cold. Imagine your boss actually suffering with you. Instant loyalty. And then came the strategy. Napoleon moved fast, like so fast that enemy generals were still unfolding their maps when he was already behind them. He split armies, crushed bigger forces, and kept delivering victories so quickly that even Paris couldn't keep up with the news. Soldiers went from half-ready to worshipping him like a rock star. Italian cities fell one after another. Generals twice his age got schooled, and Napoleon's reputation transformed overnight. He wasn't the little corporal yet, but he was already the genius general reshaping Europe's battlefield. All this before he even turned 30. Meanwhile, most of his old classmates were still figuring out how to afford wine and wigs. Napoleon. He was making emperors nervous. At 35, Napoleon decided, being a general is cool, but what if I was emperor? And the crazy part, he actually pulled it off. The French, exhausted from revolution and chaos, basically said, "Fine, just give us someone competent." So they voted him first consul, then emperor, which is wild. The same kid mocked for his accent was now bossing around Paris. And then came the coronation in 1804. Pope Pius VII showed up, ready to crown him. But Napoleon wasn't about to kneel. Nope. In front of everyone, he took the crown from the Pope's hands and put it on his own head. Translation: "Thanks, but I'll handle this myself." The message was clear. His power came from him, not the church, not tradition. Just him. It was shocking, bold, and maybe a little petty, but unforgettable. He was no longer the scrappy Corsican outsider. He was Napoleon I, Emperor of the French. And while Paris cheered, Europe collectively gasped. Because they all knew, a man this ambitious wasn't planning to stop at France. And they were right. He was just getting started. By 40, Napoleon had conquered most of Europe. But he made the one mistake every ambitious leader eventually makes. He thought he could take Russia. Spoiler: no one takes Russia. Not then, not now. In 1812, he marched an army of over 600,000 men into the Russian winter. At first, it looked like another easy campaign. But the Russians didn't play fair. They burned their own cities and fields, leaving nothing for Napoleon's troops. It wasn't battles that destroyed him. It was hunger, cold, and exhaustion. By the time he retreated, fewer than 100,000 men stumbled back, from Emperor of Europe to desperate survivor in a single season. The myth of invincibility? Gone. Still, Napoleon kept fighting. Even after the disaster, he rallied new armies and refused to quit. That stubbornness, the same fire that drove him as a boy, now kept him going past the point of reason. Admirable? Maybe. Self-destructive? Definitely. Russia wasn't just a defeat. It was the turning point. His empire started unraveling, one thread at a time. And for the first time in his career, Napoleon realized destiny doesn't always follow the plan. By 51, Napoleon's story looked less like destiny and more like irony. Defeated at Waterloo, he was shipped off to St. Helena, a tiny rock in the middle of the Atlantic. No armies, no crowns, just a grumpy ex-emperor surrounded by ocean and boredom. For a man who once redrew the map of Europe, exile felt like being grounded forever. And yet, even there, he never stopped talking strategy. He dictated memoirs, spun his legend, and painted himself as the misunderstood genius brought down by jealous kings. He was rewriting the narrative in real time, making sure that even in isolation, people would remember him as larger than life. The locals saw a short, sickly man pacing in a garden. But in his head, he was still on the battlefield, commanding armies, outsmarting rivals. When he died in 1821, some thought it was poison, others said stomach cancer. Either way, the world lost the most famous general of his age. From mocked schoolboy to emperor, to exile on a lonely rock, Napoleon lived like a storm. Loud, fast, impossible to ignore, and gone before anyone really knew what hit them.